I would like to thank you all for coming to this solemn commemoration of the Holocaust, the Shoah. In 1979, the United States Congress established days of remembrance that were to take place beginning on the 27th of Nisan, usually between April and early May, to commemorate victims of the Nazi regime, especially 6 million Jews who were murdered. The U.S. Days of Remembrance correspond to Yom HaShoah, Israel's annual Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was inaugurated by the Israeli government in 1951. So this is why we are gathered here today, as a community, to remember and to reflect. In that spirit of reflection, I want to tell you about my late grandmother, Esther Goldstein, born Belowich, of blessed memory. She was born at just 15 months old. She was brought from Poland to the United States with her parents and 3 siblings in February of 1921. Her father, Aron Belowich, was a tailor. They came to this country looking for economic opportunities, yes, but also to escape the anti-Semitism that they had experienced in Poland. 3 years later, the United States Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Act, which limited the number of immigrants allowed entry into the United States through a national origins quota. As a result, drastically limited numbers of Poles and others from Southern and Eastern Europe were allowed to emigrate to the United States. In other words, the odds that Grandma Goldstein's family would have been allowed into the U.S. had they waited 3 more years to leave would have been severely limited. That is to say, I might not be standing in front of you today. While Grandma Goldstein's nuclear family survived, most of her extended family perished in the Shoah. Today, though I never met any of them, I am remembering them. I am also thinking about Jews who were regarded by their fellow countrymen in Germany in the 10 years prior to the Second World War and the Holocaust. Especially from 1929 onward, only a minority of Germans were committed to the ideals of the Weimar Republic, chief among which was liberal democracy. From 1929 to 1933, German Jews, many of whom had achieved at least some measure of success in economic and cultural life, became increasingly isolated in German society. While most middle-class Gentiles abandoned liberal democracy, most Jews remained in the liberal democratic camp. Though the road was rocky, full of fits and starts, Jewish emancipation had slowly proceeded from the late 18th century until 1871, by which time Jews in Central Europe finally acquired equal rights. Having attached themselves to the liberal democratic movement of the 19th century, most European Jews kept that commitment into and throughout the Weimar era. Despite Jewish emancipation, the Bismarck years, that is 1871 to 1890, were conservative and authoritarian. In 1879, Berlin historian and political leader Heinrich Treitschke coined the well-known phrase, "Die Juden sind unser Unglück," the Jews are our misfortune, helping to make anti-Semitism culturally acceptable in middle-class society and introducing it into the universities. The phrase was later adopted as a motto by the widely read, sensationalist, propagandistic Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer. During the Weimar years, that is 1919 to 1933, rather than outright hatred or sympathy for Jews, what we might call a moderate anti-Semitism, this is not to downplay it, a vague sense of unease about Jews that stopped short of wanting to harm them, prevailed among non-Jewish Germans. The sort of pogroms that had occurred in Russia or the riots that accompanied the Dreyfus Affair in France were unheard of in Germany, even by 1933. Yet, because this moderate or bourgeois anti-Semitism, the kind of anti-Semitism that was deemed acceptable in polite society, was so widespread, Hitler and the Nazis could attract hardcore anti-Semites, yes, but without fear of driving away these less adamant in their disdain for Jews. In this sense, anti-Semitism was, in fact, a key to Nazi electoral successes. Ironically, by 1933, many German Jews had transitioned to some semblance of a sort of typical place in German life, even though they were experiencing anti-Semitism. This just in time for the fragile liberal democratic consensus to unravel, leading to the fall of Weimar and the rise of Hitler and the Nazi regime. I know I don't need to remind anyone in this room about the steady oppression from 1933 to 1938 of especially Jews, but also other groups like the disabled, Roma and Sinti, and others. Most of you here today understand very well the anti-Jewish boycott, 1933, the Nuremberg race laws of 35, and Kristallnacht, 1938. You also know about what followed: the ghettos, the mass shootings in the East, the death camps, and the death marches. Why then have most of my remarks been about Germany in the years prior to the Shoah? It is not because history repeats itself. It doesn't. Yet perhaps that old aphorism, usually attributed to Mark Twain, we don't really know, applies. The aphorism is, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. On October 7th of last year, the terrorist organization Hamas carried out a pogrom. They targeted primarily Israeli Jews on Israeli soil in a horrific attack. The brutal attacks represented the deadliest assault on Jews since the Holocaust. More than 1,200 were murdered and more than 200 taken hostage. After 7 months, many of the hostages remain in the clutches of Hamas. On a relatively small but unfortunately growing number of college and university campuses in the United States, some have protested peacefully what they regard as injustices committed against the citizens of Gaza. Yet, more extreme voices among their ranks have used horrific anti-Semitic language, symbols, and imagery in their protests. Some have even blocked access to buildings and other parts of their campuses. On some campuses, police and protesters have clashed. Thus, many Jewish students do not feel safe on their campuses. They hide symbols of their faith and culture out of fear for their safety. HMTC exists, as it always has and it always will, to educate students and the broader public about the dangers of such hatred. This afternoon, we remember the victims of the Shoah. I remember Grandma Goldstein's family. Many of you here today are thinking of your parents, aunts, and uncles, or grandparents. We also remember the victims of October 7th, and we think of the plight of the hostages. We strive for, and indeed we pray for, justice and for peace, both abroad and at home.